Good afternoon, everybody. Prynawn da. Welcome to this, is it extraordinary or a slightly off-piste meeting of the Democratic Services Committee? And we'll start off with item 1, which is apologies for absence. There are a few, I understand, John?
Just the one from Councillor Laura Wright.
Right, okay. Okay, one apology. And are there any declarations of interest? Otherwise, we'd all have to sign it, wouldn't we, really? Right. Right, okay then. Well, the one major item on the agenda is the electoral review consultation. And I'll pass you over to John now for thoughts on what we need to discuss, and we'll take it from there. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Chair. So just as I'll give you an overview and introduction of what we're going to sort of talk about in terms of this consultation at the minute. There's obviously two facets to it. The consultation initially on the council size, and then there'll be a separate process that comes further down the line of looking at individual wards, boundaries, names of the wards at that point, and whether they're multi-member, but they'll all be dealt with further down. So the Local Democracy and Boundary Commission are responsible for conducting a rolling programme of electoral reviews over a 10-year period. The last ones took effect at the 2022 local elections. And the next lot will obviously look to be completed ahead of 2032. If we're in the first set of councils that have their electoral review completed ahead of the elections in 2027, then our changes would take effect at that point. If we're after that election, then it'll be 2032 when these changes come around. An electoral review will look at the number of councillors that each council should have, and then the boundaries, the wards themselves, the names of the wards, and the number of councillors representing those wards. So that's all it's gonna look at. It's not technically gonna look at changing wards that already exist. So we've already got the community council wards that underpin what the county council wards are. The county council wards are made up of those community wards. And this electoral review won't look at what those community council boundaries are. It'll use those existing boundaries to make the new county council boundaries on top of that. So this initial part of the process is just looking at what an appropriate size of the county council is as a whole, i.e. how many county councillors should Monmouthshire have as part of the next electoral review. There's no statutory guidance that's in place this time for how many county councillors we should have. There's no algorithm or anything that sits behind it. We've had previous reviews where the Boundary Commission have had directions from Welsh Government that set out you should have X amount of electors to X amount of councillors. I think in the past that's tied their hands a little bit and come up with not helpful proposals. So it's good to see that there's nothing tying their hands per se in this review. That's going to mean we could end up with something that doesn't actually make sense on the ground and leaves them flexibility to make decisions that are going to be more local rather than prescriptive on a certain number of electors to councillors, for example. So in reaching their position currently, the Commission have taken account of a number of factors that summarised as follows: that there should be no less than 30 and no more than 75 councillors per county council, except for Cardiff because they've already got over 75 councillors. They based their estimates on population statistics from ONS data. They've taken account of population sparsity, deprivation and rurality, and they've also put a limit on it that there can be no more than a 10% change in the number of councillors from that we currently have to what they could actually propose. In looking at that, they've come up with an estimate that we should have between 41 to 48 county councillors as part of the next review, and we're being asked to respond to the Commission with a figure within that range that we think is most appropriate for the council going forward. In responding to the consultation, they're going to be asking us to consider, rather than just give them a number, they're going to be asking for evidence from us as to why we think that number is the most appropriate, even if it's saying that the 46 that we have now is good enough going forward. Why is it good enough? That's what they're looking for from us. And they've given a few examples of areas that they want to see the evidence coming from. One is the strategic leadership. How many councillors are needed to lead the council and to give it that direction? How many councillors do we need to provide effective scrutiny and regulatory committees? Outside bodies and partnership working, have we got enough councillors that will be able to fill all those roles to ensure our outside engagement is effective? And have we got enough councillors that provide a good enough representation of the residents that they're representing and to do all the casework that all councillors need to cover? So unless there's any questions really on what we're looking at today and what we're being asked to do, I'll probably hand it over to members to give us your views and start the conversation going.
Okay, thank you, John. And we'll pass it over to members then to find out what your views are on the size of the council in the first instance. We're 46 at the moment. Who wants more? Who could do with fewer? Peter.
Yeah, that seems right to me. The only real reason to change the existing 46 is population changes in particular areas. If I understand the figures that we're given correctly, the only one that sort of is screaming out for change would be the Portskewett area, which seems to be forecast to have a very heavy increase in population. I don't know if that's part of because of the replacement local development plan, or if that's just what's already happening in Portskewett, where there has been a lot of building of late. I would imagine it will be very difficult to split Portskewett into two separate wards with sort of a reasonable identity and a reasonably equal population. If I was really cheeky, I might say split it and call one of them Capricorn East, but that might cause some resistance. Therefore, the obvious solution there is to make that a two-member ward. And I don't know what the sort of general feeling is, whether two-member wards are to be welcomed or whether they are just something that we have to have when we can't do it another way. There are other things I want to talk about later, but I'll leave that one at that for the moment.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to come back now?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Chair. At the very last page of the agenda, I've included the current electorate forecasts per county council ward, and sort of given it a RAG rating based on its variance to what the county average is. That's the way the Boundary Commission will look at it eventually. They've said in their guidance that they want all averages to be within 20% plus or minus the county average. With that, there'll be then 3 wards that sit outside that 20% variance: Drybridge, Goby and Vower, and Portskewett. Portskewett is what it is. The electorate numbers at 2022 were very high at the time, and we suggested that they should have 2 councillors at that time. We were given 1, and like as you say, that's going to be prime for some work, whether it's just putting another councillor in there, whether it's redrawing the boundaries down there, that'll be for them to look at a future time. But really those 3 wards, Drybridge, Goby and Vower and Portskewett, are going to need reviewing, and they're going to have a knock-on effect for everything else then that comes out of it, because it could be redrawing the boundaries. And a lot of the time, I think it's not going to be as simple as giving them another councillor, because if you look at Drybridge, it's only 135% or 35% over. Giving them another councillor is going to put them too low the other way. So something different is going to have to be thought about in the way those wards are represented. But hopefully that table at the end is helpful to see where the future issues are actually going to lie.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I confine myself to talk about Portskewett, because the numbers are so big there. Whereas I guess with the other two wards, there's a possibility of slightly adjusting boundaries and so on. I know, for example, Roggett in the last election inherited a small area with a smallish population, but it was enough to put the percentages within a reasonable amount. Portskewett is just too many to do that with, I think. So you've either got to create a new ward, yeah, probably two fairly smallish wards, but just about within the 20%, or you've got to have two councillors, yeah, because numbers are just too big as projected if it happens that way.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Butler.
I suppose what I'm thinking is that it's incredibly important to get the views of each member in their wards, how they feel things are working. I know, I mean, particularly, I understand the sort of dilemma of Portskewett and sort of rising population there, but sort of rural wards have such, and I'd say probably a lot of people in Portskewett feel very sort of wedded to Portskewett rather than. I know you sort of lightly said it, Councillor Strong, about you know, redrafting it as Caldicot East, but there is such a thing as I liken it really to sheep being hefted, that the rural communities feel very much their own identity, and you'll get villages and hamlets feeling very different, although connected but very different, their identity side by side. So it's incredibly important that our residents don't feel sort of corralled or, you know, pushed in one direction. And I'd say that, you know, the councillor members are intrinsic in each ward to give us a proper feedback on how we proceed, and whether we need more councillors, fewer councillors. But it's very important that we get it right. We don't want to bulldoze anyone here. I'm sure I'll say more, but that's just all I wanted to say now.
Okay, thank you. Happy now? No?
Yeah.
Right. Councillor Neil.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for allowing me to attend the meeting in Councillor Keir's absence. Just a couple at this stage of questions, if I may. I don't know whether, John, you could give us your view on whether MCC are likely to be subjected to implementation at 2027 or at 2032. I think, you know, we've got our own views on that, but it would be really helpful to have your insight. Secondly, you mentioned, I think, John, though I may have noted this or heard it wrongly, but that there effectively would not be any review of community council boundaries. I'm just trying to understand how the wider boundary could be reviewed if there was no review of community councils. You know, so you know, if the overall ward grew by whatever 20% and it took it to a size, a scale that was deemed too great for the criteria of you know, a councillor to oversee, how would that be dealt with if it weren't to change the boundaries around community wards? It would be good to know that. Yeah, there are a couple of questions that I'm sure we'll get to later on about, you know, the forward plan, but just the third one at this stage is what sort of consultation is, it's not just about consultation, but explanation is planned for communities themselves as well as community councils. My sense would be that there is a general mood of not more councillors, not more Senate members, you know, and not more expenditure on the structure, the democratic structure, but more on the delivery of frontline services. And it would be interesting to know whether or not we're going to gauge that sort of view in whatever consultation we carry out. But those in the meantime, thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor Neil. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll pick those up, Councillor Neil. First one around the sort of comm side of stuff. the Boundary Commission will be leading on everything that they do here. We're a consultee along with all the other county councils, but so are community councils and the police. There's statutory consultees and all that are being given the opportunity to respond to the Commission as well. So they'll have that local feedback, even though it doesn't, this change doesn't massively impact on the community councils. They will be a statutory consultee in that process. On the date of implementation, the honest answer is I have no insight. All they've done is, as part of the review, and it's in the document, is published rough dates of when a review will start, and they've done that in sort of 3 or 4 stages. We don't know where we are in that process. In the last electoral review in 2022, we were the last one to be reviewed, but that was because we were undertaking a full council-wide community council review. And they couldn't commence the county council review until our community council boundaries were signed off, because otherwise they'd be making proposals on boundaries that yet were to exist effectively. And then that leads on to your final point around what happens if we don't change community boundaries. The last community review we did it was a pretty extensive bit of work, and actually we've changed the way everybody else is starting to do their community reviews now. They were always done a little bit piecemeal. A new housing estate goes up and we'll tweak that boundary there and we'll sign off that change for that one little ward. We started from scratch. We took the blank piece of paper and we went, right, what do we want? What's our policy on it? How can we make this look? It took a long time to do, but it's actually the way everybody else is starting to do that. So whilst our community review took effect in 2022, other councils are only just starting that community review now, so they're already looking at that. We're not in that position to be able to do it. There is something within the Commission's rules that they can apply a consequential change to a community boundary based on the outcome of an electoral review. But I've never known one to actually happen and take place. They tend to use those community boundaries as the building blocks of what the new county council wards will be. So where there's an issue, they don't tend to redraw the boundaries. They look at taking on a ward from a neighbouring community council and wrapping that into the electoral ward. So if, for example, we say Drybridge is an issue, let's take Portskewitt. They could take the Severn ward, which is the other side of the railway down there, put that ward of Caldicot, which is currently in Caldicot, in with the Portskewitt County ward, make that a multi-member ward, and if it matches their numbers, that's what they would do. So essentially it's ward pinching rather than redrawing of the lines. There is a small element where they can, but as I say, I've not known them actually come and redraw the community boundaries, because that's our responsibility and we should have already looked at that, and we did that in 2022. And there's still a fallout for community councils from those decisions. There's still sort of ongoing and letting those new boundaries we put in place embed into the current arrangements. But again, if we're at the end of the next electoral review, we probably won't be starting our review until 2030, something like that. That's another 5 years away. So the 5-year forecast we've put in place currently will need to be a 10-year forecast. We might have more issues with our community boundaries if we're at the end of the next electoral review compared to where we are now. So the later we are in the programme, the probably more difficult it's going to end up being for us, and we're going to have to think about how we can manage that and what the knock-on effects of those changes that just naturally happen over time are going to have.
Thank you, John. You're making the job sound easy, aren't you? Right, we'll move on then. Councillor Howells.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, John. I'm looking at our ward, so Llanfairpwll and Usk, 2022, that was changed, and it's very different. So, we've got a town ward, residents, obviously, but also very rural when we get to sort of Llanfairpwll. So I'm not sure the two go together, really. You're covering all aspects there. So I do find that a little bit difficult, sort of covering, focusing on what our town issues and then moving into sort of country issues. So that's just you know, so if there is going to be any further change, then maybe that could be addressed again. I don't know. But looking at the figures here, so the projected growth for 5 years, is that from our own figures, the 4,538? So we're fairly confident that's the approach we're going to get. And are we suggesting 48 councillors to cover that? So to increase the coverage? I'm looking at the average councillor doing currently 1,634. And if we increase it by 48, we will then be also increasing our residents or constituents to 1,661. So even with the increase, we'd be taking on an extra 27 constituents. Does that sound right?
I
on
think,
average?
I think I've left it as 46 in that table.
Oh, right, okay.
Just giving you the figures, because the range that they're proposing is between 1 and 48.
Yeah.
So I think it was more just showing you what the effect on that average is based on keeping it at 46 now, because the table would be never ending if we done 41 to 48 examples. But obviously, the more councillors we have, the lower that number
Come down, yeah. So, even at 46, our individual would be increased fairly substantially, about 100 or something like that per constituent.
I haven't done the figures. I think it was more a case of providing you with where we are now and what the current arrangements will reflect. And the figures are there for everybody to obviously work out how that impacts on their own wards. I think what might be helpful is under the review before last, the councillor elector average was aimed at 1,750. And under the last review, it was probably around 1,650, I think, was the aim for the electoral review at the 2022 election. So it's around where they want to be. And I think our community review that we did helped us with that. It sort of addressed to make sure we didn't have too many wards that were way out of line with where we were looking, particularly in the towns, because those wards in the towns were getting just developments over time. The numbers were getting skewed massively, particularly in Chepstow. We'd have one ward that would have 2,300 voters in, and another ward that might only have 1,500 in. And then you've got one way above the average and one too low on the average. So we were able to address those as part of the community review to give them a bit more longevity, which is why we're not looking at another community review, because it's just going to cause more upset to the boundaries that came in 2022, and they're still trying to embed those changes into place.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Howells. Councillor McConnell.
Thank you. Just comment on the comments. It's an art as well as a science, isn't it? So that sense of people identifying with the place or place having its own identity, and it can quite often, we can't just go by the numbers. So I think that's a really welcomed approach. It was just something, John, you talked about where there was a question about how we communicate this outwards, and you suggested that we're consultees, so it's not our job is to communicate our response to the consultation. I think we can still I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to consider some sort of communication about this process is in train. So I'm just thinking about as an officer in my union, we quite often publish our responses to government consultations about things. It's not, so I think saying that we're doing this is not a bad thing to do. And sooner rather than later, and then people don't feel they're being boxed into a corner or have never had a chance to speak to their councillor or ask for an explanation. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on this one?
Point taken. I think it'll help as well that our responses go into Cabinet, because it'll be Cabinet who ultimately submit the response on behalf of the council. What's not helpful, I don't think, is the short timescale we've had anyway. We come out, I can't remember when it was, but we haven't had very long to get together to consider the response and to formulate something. But I'll take it away and have a think.
Thank you. Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Chair. John, what do we need to have achieved? Sort of recommendations to Cabinet, so that Cabinet take it on. What do we initially need to achieve in our responses? So if you could just elucidate, thank you.
Yeah, I think what I'm looking from the committee today is what in that range would be the ideal number that the committee thinks we should be making a recommendation to. Was it 41? Is it 48? Is it something in between? And then I bring it back to those points that I made that the Commission are looking for evidence on and why, which is how many councillors do we actually need to lead? So how many is going to be in our cabinet and what are their roles potentially going to be? It's difficult for us as a committee to say that because that's at the leader's discretion. So I struggle with giving that because as much as we might want it, it's not in our gift to do so much. But thinking about that more widely, how many do we need to lead the council? How many members would we roughly need around scrutiny and regulatory? Are we doing enough with our members outside of the council? What would they be doing? And are we doing enough interaction with our residents? Are the numbers that we're managing at the minute, the 1,660 voters, are they getting good coverage and good representation from the 46? Do we need more? Are they getting overkill and we need less? They're the sort of questions that the Boundary Commission want us to consider as part of our response. And that's kind of what I'm looking for really today as a steer to put as a recommendation to Cabinet.
Thank you, John. That's good. That's nice and clear. I think, sort of personally, I'd like to know, on the basis of 46 councillors, which is what we have at the moment, how many cabinet posts are you are you allowed? As in, I think I know, but it would be quite useful for residents to know, sort of based on the number of councillors, how many cabinet posts are likely to be produced from that. And if it went up to 48, would that calculation, change materially? And also, just a point really, sometimes, not always, but sometimes a two-member ward can confuse residents. They don't quite know who's representing them. I understand this thing of, when you've got lots of people in an area, they may well need more than one councillor, but I'm just sort of, I suppose, making the point that it can be confusing. And obviously we want to be as clear with our residents as possible. So that's that. Anyway, thanks, John. If you could let me know that.
Yeah, I'll stand to be corrected, but I'm 99% sure there's 9 cabinet members plus the leader. That is the amount you can have in cabinet. That won't be changed under this review. That's in a completely separate bit of legislation that sets out how councils function, not depending on the electoral review. You could have this, for example. That said, the functions of the independent remuneration panel, which set out how many senior posts we can remunerate in the council and the level of pay that councillors get, is moving under the Democracy and Boundary Commission. So they're becoming a bit more, they're having a wider responsibility, looking at the number of councillors, how they're remunerated, and then other structures within the council. So to say that won't change in the future, I don't know, but it's becoming more under one umbrella rather than having sort of different bits doing different things. In terms of the multi-member wards, I think our council's position has always been a cross-party that the preference is for single-member wards where possible. I don't think that's changed, and I've not heard anything from anybody to suggest that that's not changed for the reasons you've set out there, that if you have one member, people know where to go and where the accountability is for their individual ward. It's not always the case as part of the electoral review. When you're dealing with those numbers and that 20% variance, sometimes there'll be a need. So, for example, if you're looking at Drybridge, I can't see under the proposals that Drybridge will stay as a single-member ward, given how far over that 20% variance it is. That that will likely lead to an increase in the multi-member wards looking at inwards to keep it within the Monmouth Town Council area, perhaps as joining with Overmono, and then that becoming a multi-member ward. But again, you just need to do the maths and work out the figures. But essentially, that's what we're playing off. It'll be our preference, and I think if the committee agrees that that's something we put towards Cabinet, is that the retention of single-member wards is preferable, then we can put that in. But when we come to actually looking at the details, the number of councillors to electors and the boundaries that we've got to work with, it might not always be the case that we end up with that, as it did in the last review where we went from 1 multi-member ward to 6.
Thank you, John. Councillor Davis.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, John. I think you've largely addressed the questions which I had in mind, prompted, as you were, by those recent questions by Councillor Butler about the ask of this committee. But just to be absolutely crystal clear, if I've understood the cover sheet to today's paper, the ask is for this committee to reach some preliminary recommendations of its own and to entrust the chair or to delegate the chair to write in those terms, expressing the committee's views. Now, from what I've heard today and from canvassing the views of colleagues, I think it would be somewhat premature for us to reach any recommendations, however preliminary or however draft, because not least given the nature of this consultation and the questions around member casework, the effectiveness of our scrutiny structures, there is a need here to collate clearly a lot of qualitative evidence, and as we've heard from many council colleagues, to canvass the views of those who know best and who are best placed to reflect on their experience and their reflection on the effectiveness of our scrutiny structures, namely my fellow councillors. So I just wanted to be crystal clear that we are not being asked today to make any firm recommendations, because I think that would be deeply premature. And perhaps you could outline what qualitative evidence do you currently have that you can draw upon to furnish this authority's response to this consultation? What additional qualitative insights might you require, and how might you approach collating those valuable feedback and insights from our members and from our wider communities in particular? Thank you, John.
Yeah, I think unfortunately that's the nature of having such a short consultation period and notice of it is we really need to get something from the committee today to Cabinet to be able to get it in by, I think it's the 29th of March or something like that. We've had a little extension so we can take it to the 2nd of April Cabinet if we need to, from the Boundary Commission to put a response in. But if the committee doesn't feel it's in a position to give a response to Cabinet, then it could be left to Cabinet themselves to put a response together. Political groups can put a response in, individual members can put a response in. I think unfortunately we're just hampered by that short timeline to get the evidence in that you're suggesting that we should need to make an informed decision. Around what evidence do we have? Again, it's limited. We haven't had opportunity to really ask those questions of how effective is the scrutiny, and we should be looking at what the scrutiny manager's view is, and scrutiny members are they undertaking the level of work they need? Are the meetings too long? Do we need more frequent meetings? And if we do we need more members to be having more frequent meetings? All those points will build up a picture of what the response would be like. I haven't got that information, unfortunately, and the timescales wouldn't allow us to have captured all that effectively, sorry.
Okay, thank you, John. Moving on then to Councillor Thomas.
Okay, diolch yn fawr, thanks. In some ways, I agree with what Councillor Thomas Davis said in terms of not having that evidence to hand, but more comments and questions. Looking around, I think there's about 3 of us here who were in the last administration. We had the last boundary review. My own sort of gut feeling is that within reason, it would be better to allow that to sort of bed in. I know it's over a period of time, but I think did we go from something like 40 members last time or 42, I think, up to 46, which seems to be a reasonable number from looking at our overall population of something like 94,000. But I think the other thing we need to take into account, and I agree with the points you made about multi-member wards not being popular. They're certainly not popular with people who live in them. Single member wards, people know who to go to and who to hold to account. You know, if they've gone to a particular councillor in their ward and nothing happens, then yes, they can sort of complain about it. But if it's a multi-member ward, it's difficult. But I honestly think that we should, within reason, adhere to the current sort of changes, although they weren't popular at the time, and in fact very unpopular with some people, which affected, you know, who were affected, councillors were affected by ward changes. But in reality, it actually brought together wards and took out some of the anomalies. And I can think of my own ward, Park in Abergavenny, probably applies to other ones as well, where under the Boundary Commission, before the change, I had one side of Park Crescent, Councillor Grocott had the other half, and it's quite confusing for people living there, and it didn't sort of give cohesion. So lots of those anomalies have been ironed out. So my own feeling is, within reason, we should stick to what we've got, which seems ballpark a reasonable number. But I do think as well there are huge differences between the rural wards and the urban ones. I live in a rural ward. I live in Gobion Fawr, but obviously I represent a ward in town. But there's huge differences there. I think you can't purely go on numbers. You've got to go on actually as well. You know, for a member who's got Gobion Fawr, it's a huge area to cover with very isolated communities, houses, etc. Like I see Councillor Neil nodding now, but you know it is a difficulty, and I think much as we can, we might take some of those things into account if we do go to review to sort of bring communities together and people feel part of it. So I think it's almost an impossible task today, isn't it? You know, you've been given such a short deadline. It is virtually impossible to make meaningful changes. But I think we should, within reason, stay at status quo. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. John, do you want to make any comment now? What would be the implications of staying as we are?
I think just for clarity, we went from 43 to 46 councillors. Under the last review, we just had the one multi-member ward, but we changed to 6, and we had the additional 3 councillors come in. The implications of staying as we are, it's difficult to say, given that those changes only came in 2022. I think for us, they're still embedding into practice a little bit as well. Going from one multi-member ward that's historically been a multi-member ward to 6 multi-member wards where they had to, you know, put in completely different, you know, new working practices and working together, particularly if you take Councillor Davis's ward, where it's a multi-member ward that's split between parties as well. That can add another dynamic to the scenario as well. So the impact of it would be, you know, common sense potentially. If we have our review early on in the process and the changes take effect for 2027, would it be more ideal that we keep the same arrangements? Possibly, because I still think they're finding their feet and working their way in. But there are a couple of anomalies, like say Drybridge, Portskewett, and Gobion Fawr, that will need looking at. And the trouble is, you know, when we did the community review, there's always a knock-on effect with everything we do. When you look at the boundaries, you can start from the northeast and work your way down, and you'll get one view. You can start from the other end and work your way up. You'll get a completely different view, and it's just the way it is. So yeah, difficult. I think what we would look to do, though, coming back on the evidence, and what worked really well last time for us was we created a cross-party working group of members, politically balanced, so that we could actually sit down and look at the proposals, and rather than having it in a committee style, we would take it away from the committee and make it much more informal, look at the effects of the proposals and how we could do that. And as part of that I think is where we can gather more evidence to be able to go back to the Commission with actual proposals that say this is why we think this would work better. That when we're doing the electoral review, that'll give us the time that we need to be gathering that evidence, and in the lead up to it, and using that evidence then to give an evidence-based proposal or counter proposal back to the Boundary Commission to say this is why we think this would be better than perhaps what they put forward in their draft proposals.
Thank you, John. Moving on then, Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it is unfortunate that the time in which to get a response in is so short. I thought that consultations were normally supposed to be at least 6 weeks, and the fact that these proposals might not be brought into effect until 2032 in some areas seems to be somewhat rushed, and even in relation to 2027. I also don't like the fact that it isn't taking a grassroots approach. In other words, it's not consulting with the community councils that make up these particular areas and their views about the identity and so forth of their particular areas. I tend to agree with Councillor Thomas that I think the initial response is to maintain the status quo and keep the same number. I don't believe that multi-councillor wards work well. I know in the report it says, not more than 4, but I think that 1 always works better than 2, because of the fact that it is clear to the electorate who they are, who's representing them, and who they should consult about particular matters, so, and also on occasions they aren't the same political parties, which can in a sense create some friction in terms of the smooth running of wards that are more than two councillors. I don't think the same applies if the 2 people are of the same political party. So I'll be very much in favour of, at the moment, maintaining the status quo in relation to it, and that single councillor wards work much better than anything above 1. And in relation to the report that I read, it was suggesting that the names of all the wards, and if this is going to affect 2027, I think it's very important, would be Welsh. Now, I would argue for bilingual names. In other words, I would like my ward to be called Shire Newton Ward and its Welsh equivalent, so that both names were on the electoral form, because we did have the issue whereby on the other consultation it was suggested that there was monolingual wards, and I don't think that works. And it does mention in the document about it being in the Welsh language. I mean, bearing in mind that the Welsh governments are proposing that by 2050 there should be 1 million Welsh speakers. Well, since the population of Wales is over 3 million, it still means that 2/3 will not speak Welsh, and it's even lower than that. Actually, if you look, the percentage of people in Monmouthshire and Torfaen, for example, who actually speak Welsh is quite low. So I think we should make a proposal about the fact that wards themselves should be bilingual. I think that's an important point, and I really think the response, particularly in view of the shortage of the consultation phase, is that we should maintain the status quo with regard to the number of councillors. I mean, I would have thought that those people whose wards affected are the ones who really need to give a response, and they need to have the opportunity to consult with their community councils. And this short time period isn't allowing them to do either of these things. And the other thing I think that needs to be borne in mind is that it does, you've done it on a 5-year forecast. Well, for us, the next election is 2027, and actually quite a lot of the building that you have in wards is phased in, and after a year or two there isn't that actual much difference in the numbers that you're talking about. If you look at the last LDP and how many were built, I mean the proposal was that there should be an increase of 4,500. Well, over that time period only 3,000 were actually built. So if the forecast that we've got is based on the RLDP, which we haven't actually finally agreed in council, then perhaps at this stage we may well be overestimating the numbers anyway.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Do you want to come back at this stage, John?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
On the statistics and old LDP figures, new LDP figures, etc., we've taken them from planning directly, and some of those figures for the 5-year forecast now include overspills from the last LDP for where there are still properties to be built from the decisions that we made previously, as well as the key sites that are being put forward under the next LDP. So it's taken account of as much as we know of at the minute on what is forecast to be built in that time. I did say earlier on that community councils are a statutory consultee as part of the process, so they should have received information directly from the Commission in the same way we have, and be able to respond to the consultation if they want to. Again, it's difficult at the minute to, as you say, for a member to go back to a community council to talk about their ward, because we're not actually talking about wards as part of this consultation. We're talking about the whole council, what that looks like. So there isn't individual ward specifics to be taken back at the moment. On the Welsh wards, the Welsh names, yeah, I think that's following a trend from the Senedd election, where they're looking mostly at Welsh names for the Senedd constituencies, and maybe that's going to be a knock-on effect for us as the county councils, because it is a recommendation in there that wards will be predominantly Welsh names.
I mean, but in this consultation, surely we can put the recommendation that it's bilingual. I mean, we're asking for responses, and I think that's very important in terms of, the identity of people in your particular ward as well. So I would strongly argue that the recommendation should be that we want, if there's any change in names, we want them to be bilingual. And obviously, I can provide the statistics of the number of people in Monmouthshire who actually speak Welsh, and it's just not sensible not to have it bilingual.
Yep.
So, and also I think the other point is the other 2 points that I was making, that I'd like to go across to the recommendation of Cabinet is, in view of the short period of consultation, we would like to maintain the status quo. And then the third point was basically the preference for single member wards. So there was really 3 points, Chair, John, that I would like to be included in our response if that's something that the committee agrees. And I think it's something that Councillor Thomas was suggesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. We'll move on. We'll hear all the perspectives, then we'll try and get some consensus after that. Councillor Strong.
Thank you. I'm happy to agree that where possible, single-member wards should be the model. But keeping the exact status quo, I think, still leaves us with the problem of Portscewart, which is already a very big ward. It would be interesting to know what Councillor Dimmock from Portscewart feels about this, but it's already a very big ward. Since 2022, there's been a lot of building there. I'm not sure if all the new building in Subbrook and indeed Portscewart itself was before or after 2022. I think a lot of it was after. Certainly the Severn View estate, which is still being built, would increase the population of that ward even more. And if the RDLP goes through, it's going to increase absolutely massively if you keep the existing boundaries. But the problem is it's a moving target, isn't it? And you don't quite know how fast and how far it's going to move. If the revised development plan went through and all those 700 houses were built, that would qualify for a ward on its own, more or less. Yeah, especially when you put these surrounding houses in the Crick area with it, and would reduce Portscrew to a more sensible level, perhaps. But as already been pointed out, that plan has not even been passed by council yet, let alone put into fruition. So we don't really know. I would therefore suggest that for the time being, consideration be given to Portscrew becoming a two-member ward. I mean, that's not a party political thing. I have no idea which party that would benefit, but there is a democratic deficit if you've got a ward with well over 2,000 people in it, and another one with perhaps, I don't know, 800 or something like that, and that would fall outside the 20% anyway, and so we'd have to do something about that. And I would say for the time being, a two-member ward might be the most expedient temporary measure for that, waiting to see whether it becomes necessary later to split the ward. And just on that, can I make it absolutely clear that when I suggested that the name Caldicott East be adopted for the development, I was being deliberately facetious. It was a joke. I don't want it to be called Caldicott East. I've already made a suggestion we call it Ballinmore in line with the historical area, or maybe something to do with Crick or whatever. That's for others to decide at a later stage, but I don't want to get into trouble on that. I would like to say more about ward names perhaps at a later stage, if that's something that we are discussing today, because I think there is more to it than that. But for the moment, the issue of scrutiny has come up, and again, it's a moving target. I'm trying to do some maths at the moment. If you look at the balance of council at the moment, when I think it's 21, and then two lots of two, yeah, the ruling group, 21 councillors, but out of that you've got to take, 9 cabinet members and a leader. So that only leaves 11 across the various scrutiny groups, scrutiny committees. Whereas in the main opposition, it's 21 councillors. I suspect, I think the opposition leader doesn't sit on scrutiny committee, but the rest do. I think so. But either way, that leaves 20. One side got 11 to cover it, the other side got 20. Yeah. Now, that could change from time to time. If, for example, there were 25 in the ruling group, that would be 15 to do with scrutiny. That would probably be, say, 17 in the main opposition, still 17 to do with scrutiny. So if you've got a very tight, almost balanced council, it can be a problem. But that's we can't really recommend at this stage we do this, because 2027, things might change. Yeah. So it's a very difficult one. I don't think there's enough of a problem to recommend any change in the size of the council from a scrutiny point of view, though. But I do think the possibility of one extra because of a particular issue at Portscrew could be considered. And I don't really want to speak for Portscrew. It's not my ward. Okay, other people know Portscrew better than I do. But just from the point of view of numbers, it's something that's worth thinking about, that we might have to think about because of the 20% limits. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Strong. Councillor Davis.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, I find myself agreeing with much of what both Councillor Tudor Thomas and Councillor Peter Strong have said this afternoon. I think, by and large, the current ward arrangements work well. We've not long gone through this process of redrawing the political map here in Monmouthshire. I'm superficially, at least, attracted to allowing these wards to further embed in. As a two-member ward member myself, I don't necessarily share the reservations and concerns of Councillor Louise Brown. In fact, far from it, I can see considerable advantage in sharing, particularly the casework load, which is only growing as local councillors, between a second ward member and, as I hope people saw last week in the budget debate, my fellow ward member, I do have cordial relationships and work reasonably well together. So I'm not politically or ideologically opposed to multi-member wards. On balance, I think we should not make any dramatic recommendations for those reasons, though, as Councillor Strong has outlined, there is this outlying case in Portscrew which does warrant further reflection and consideration. And perhaps on balance, if I was to summarise the interventions of other members, far from me to put words into their own mouths, but if I was to summarise a theme that seems to be emerging, I think there may be some begrudging recognition that we may want to suggest that the council expands to 47, but no more than 47 members. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Buckler.
Thank you. Actually, I'm probably going to echo quite a lot of what Councillor Davis said. I agree with a lot of points that have been made by Councillor Thomas and also Councillor Strong. And Councillor Strong, I'm glad you've clarified that. That's why I said it. You said it lightly, but I suppose the point I was making there is that people feel very, very strongly about where they come from, where they live, and that we must take that into account. I personally think, we are a growing population, and there is this dilemma in places like Portskewett, but I don't think we should nail our colours to the mast now, because I think we should do a lot more consultation in our wards and with our councillor members. But as Councillor Thomas would say, my gut feeling is that we should consider recommending that we have 47 members to the cabinet because of our burgeoning population, and we are going to need to consider that. So that would be what I'd like to see the committee come up with.
Thank you, Councillor Buckler. John, do you want to come in at this stage, or?
Yeah, not looking to obviously cut anyone else off who wants to speak at the moment, but I think we're getting a theme coming forward from the discussions. What I'd be reluctant at the moment to be making any recommendations in response to the consultation on particular wards. That's not what this is about at the minute. This is how many councillors should we have. I think what I'm getting as feedback is we're happy with the methodology used to reach the range that we've got, the 41 to 48. Ultimately, we're happy with the status quo-ish at the minute. But because of the short consultation period and because we haven't had a chance to go and gather the evidence, we'd be happy that when we come to the electoral review process, that we'd be looking at a range of councillors within that 41 to 48 option. So at least that then gives us the flexibility to work with the Boundary Commission to say we're happy with the methodology of coming up with a number of councillors within that range, but we'll only know what we want it to be or what it needs to be when we actually start doing the work of looking at what the wards look like and the impact of those. Because we're saying at the minute, Portskewett should have one, but again, once you start looking at where's the other problem wards and then merging wards there, it always has a big knock-on effect further down. So I'd be reluctant to try and tie you to a specific number today, perhaps using that we need more evidence, and we'll gather that evidence ahead of the actual electoral review starting. But ultimately, the methodology of coming up with the range of 41 to 48, we're happy with, and we support to take that into the electoral review. That gives us that flexibility to determine whether it should be 47, 48, 46, when we start looking at some of the detail.
Thank you, John. There's some nods in the chamber. We're making progress. Thank you. We'll move on then. Councillor Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Diolch. I'd agree with how John has sort of summed it up and what Councillor Davis and Councillor Brown have said. The one thing I would strongly disagree with, that Councillor Louise Brown said that we should not have Welsh names. I wouldn't be happy with that recommendation going forward. Obviously, if the majority wanted it, then I'll have to accept it. But we do live in Wales. If you're in Scotland, you have Welsh, you have Scottish names for councils, authorities, etc. Same with Northern Ireland. So I don't see a huge problem there. And I personally, I think people are quite happy with the Welsh names. And certainly, if you look at our own policy in Monmouthshire for the naming of estates, etc., they are always given generally Welsh names because we are in Wales. So I'd find it a bit odd to have to go to a more sort of bilingual situation. But that might be a personal view. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Councillor McConnell.
Thank you. A couple of things. We are going in the same direction, so I'm not going to repeat those things which I've been very broadly in line with. This is going to our recommendation will go to Cabinet. Is that right? Yeah. I think we should indicate that we think that the single member wards are preferable. That's my feeling. So that the retention of single member wards is preferable, or even the creation. So if it turns out that it's possible, we should be minded if the possibility arose going forward that we could resolve that into single member wards. That I think would be preferable. I think the idea of consulting with, and an agreement with that the numbers are, the calculation numbers is right, and we've got an eye to Portskewett as something which needs a good look at, is the thing. I'm also going to just, in terms of registering where we all sit on this, I'm going to align myself with the comments that Councillor Thomas made about the use of Welsh names in Welsh areas. I'm from Scotland. In fact, most of the names in Scotland are not Scottish. They sound Scottish, but the Gaelic name has all disappeared a long time ago, and it's a tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McConnell. John, okay, right? Yeah. Right, we'll move on then to Councillor Howells.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with John's recommendations there of the agreeing to the methodology. I am a little bit concerned that the predicted amount is 4,538, so that would be quite a substantial amount for even two extra councillors would be equivalent of 2,269 per extra councillor. So I think we'll go along with the agreement that you say that we'll consider that at a later stage, whether it's a variance from 41 to 48, but keep it relatively open. I agree with Councillor Tudor Thomas as well, and Councillor McConnell with regards to the Welsh names. So I would be happy to promote that if that was the case. Along with Councillor Buckler and Councillor Brown, with the confusion on the double wards, I can see that as well, especially when there is a political difference in the councillors there. So I do experience that. Not so much that some residents will play the two of us, without us knowing, so that we're almost wasting our time. So if one person is doing the work, and then another person is doing it, and we don't always know. We try and liaise with each other if there is a case, but it's not always the case that we might have gone down that road already to investigate it, and then find we're both doing the same job. So I do agree with Councillor Buckler and Councillor Brown on the confusion that sometimes brings. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Howells. Councillor Strong. Sorry, did you want to go back now? Councillor Strong, you going to dig further now?
Something on the names of wards. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to use Welsh names where they are appropriate and easily understood. We have a rising generation who have been taught Welsh in school. Again, if I use Portskewett as an example, I think they would recognise Portskewett as Portskewett quite easily, and it's not much to learn. But I must admit that reading points 67 to 69 in the report, I don't really understand it all and how it would work. For example, they say you should use a single Welsh word. We can't even get away with a single English word. I mean, again, the example of Portskewett. Portskewett isn't a word, it's Portskewett and Sudbrook. Good luck in finding a single Welsh word for that. Yeah. Sometimes there's no Welsh translation, and I admit it says it shouldn't supersede existing village names. I don't think you can translate Roggett into Welsh. Apparently it comes from Rogers Gate. Are we going to do a literal translation? I really don't think that would be welcomed by the people of Roggett. It might get away from the problem of people who think it's called Roger, but that's as far as we would get. And you get other curiosities. I mean, Caldicot, we get Keely Coed being used as Welsh for Caldicot, but it's certainly not a translation. There's no evidence of it ever being used before about the beginning of the 19th century, when there's a complicated story as how that possibly came about. So what are we going to do about that one without creating some sort of historical aberration? Yeah. So what I would, to simplify what I'm trying to say is, I think we should ask for reasonable flexibility in the naming of wards, but it should come back to local communities. I think probably Councillor Brown would agree with that in terms of the consultation that people in the local community should have as much say as possible in the naming of our wards. She's not nodding.
Yeah.
Hang on then.
Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, Councillor Brown. Just checking that John doesn't want to come back on that one.
No, I think I agree with Councillor Strong. I think we can see it. We've had discussions with sort of the Welsh Language Commissioner's Office before, where they've got an interpretation on a locality that's different to the locality that the council's been using, and that's different to someone else uses. There's all different dialects everywhere, and which one is right? Well, they're all kind of right in their own sort of sense, or they're all wrong in their own sense, depends which way you want to look at it.
We need to get back to Councillor Watts on the pronunciation of Caldicot, because there's a real bearing on this.
But yeah, I think in the same way the wards are going to not please everybody, the names of the wards aren't going to please everybody as well. But I'm getting that we haven't got a consensus on whether they should be Welsh only, but a lead into local flexibility and allowing us to offer an interpretation of what the localism actually is, possibly.
Right, we'll move on to the member for Dre Newydd, Gelli Farch, Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think, possibly, obviously we don't know what the views of, the other councillors are, because of the fact that there's only a small number of us on this committee. I think that in terms of the wards, one of the things that was actually said was that in the consultation, it's about the identity of people with their particular area, and it's the same way that I think that people identify with Monmouthshire. I think they identify with particular ward names, and that's the reason for advocating it being bilingual. But obviously, it's something, I mean, if the community councils felt strongly one way or the other, then I think that should be taken into account. But I'm not sure whether or not we represent on this committee the views of all the councillors in the council with regard to whether it should be bilingual or not. I think it should, because I think it avoids confusion. And I think it basically, it's a bit like street signs, in a sense that it's what people identify a certain area with. Thank you. And I think the identity point was something that was made in this consultation.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Brown. John? No? Okay. Councillor Neil, let's have a Scottish perspective then, shall we?
Well, I've lived here for 30 years, Chair, so I think I almost think I've got a Valleys accent now. But on the Valleys about 500 miles further north, I suppose. But okay. Actually, on the bilingual point, I think there's a pragmatic approach that should be taken, and it does seem to me that bilingual would be the appropriate thing, and not monolingual. In Scotland, it's not just the pronunciation; it's the spelling that would challenge anyone. If you've ever had a go at spelling Ecclefechan or Kikubri or Mulgai, you might want to take a couple of minutes out and see how well you do, but it can be pretty challenging. But bilingual seems very pragmatic in our situation. I did wonder, John, what would be the next stage of report that we would be seeing as a council? When would you anticipate the next report to be coming out the way of democratic services, but more broadly the council itself?
I think the next phase of it really will depend on where we are in their electoral review programme. The Commission will publish a report as a result of this consultation, and that might put specific constraints in it for us that doesn't allow flexibility. It might not. We'll have to wait and see on that one. But the next phase from the Commission should be giving us an indication of where we are within that electoral review programme, so we can start to prepare properly, as I say, to sort of put things like a working group in place to specifically review the knock-on effects of what those boundaries changes might be, and then be able to report back to Democratic Services, who will then ultimately, before they submit a response, I'll have to check with James, because last time it went to Council, but the interpretation from James is it goes back to Cabinet. I need to double check where the response will end up. But the next phase will be actually getting down to the nitty-gritty of what the future wards will be like, based on the criteria that the Commission have set for us, and working through all those different scenarios of what they might end up looking like.
Thank you, John. Councillor Buckler.
Thank you, Chair. Having been brought up in Sutherland, and have as a child had a lot of experience of the Gaelic, but also the place names were often Norse, and it gave you a sense of history, which was incredibly important, and again helped sort of tether you to the land that you'd come from. I personally think that a sense of history is vital, and I think bilingual gives you the sense of history. And I can't, I'm absolutely proponent of the Welsh language thriving, and our children learning it and it being embedded in Wales. It's sort of completely right that is the case. But I also think we should note the history of the Principality of Wales, I'm a proponent of bilingual. But as was also mentioned by Councillor Strong, that we need to know what our residents want. So I think to have a proper consultation, each member in their wards, to find out exactly what they want to be called, because I think we can't be arbitrary about this. Anyway, it's a very interesting conversation, which I'm sure we'll come back to. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Buckler. We've got everybody's say having been said, I think. In order to move forward, we need some consensus, and John's suggestion earlier on of the 3 points, would that be, or a variation of that be, would you be happy as a committee to pass that forward to Cabinet to decide on their next move? And no doubt this is going to come back to us at some point when the Commission have actually made a ruling.
Shall I summarise again?
Yeah, if you'd like to summarise, if you will summarise, sorry, John. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'll summarise those points again, just so we're clear. Just on the last point around the names, I wouldn't dwell too much on the names of what they might be or what form they could take at the moment, because we don't know what the wards will be to know what names they should eventually have. We're just assuming it'll be the same and give a name to what already exists. But I think, again, I think we need to pull back more to the flexibility of allowing us to give an evidence-based argument at the time when we're reviewing the actual arrangements of what they might look like, rather than trying to make a preemptive assumption now at this stage too much. So the main points I've got that we want to put forward to Cabinet for a response is, given that we've had the changes come in 2022 of all new boundary changes and electoral arrangements, at the moment the status quo would be the ideal position, but we acknowledge that there are certain wards that are going to be outside of the criteria that we'll need looking at. We agree with the methodology that the Commission has put forward to identify a range of councillors that we fall within, but we'd be looking at having flexibility within that range when we look at the proposals to put forward recommendations within that range to the Commission. We haven't got a status quo on bilingual ward names. I think that's fairly clear from the points we've got. Some are for Welsh names, some are for bilingual. but again, allow us that local flexibility to put names forward once we know what those wards could actually end up looking like, so we get that localism attached to the area that we're proposing. And I think Councillor Strong made a really good point earlier on that preempting what we might need post-2027 or post-2032 to run the council, what the governance arrangements should look like, will be difficult because the balance of the council will significantly impact on the ability for members to carry out the role that they're allocated within the council. And we got to have that flexibility as well as part of the review process to be able to have that say at that particular time and make sure that's factored in post-election, which we just don't know what the outcome will obviously be. I think they're the main points that we've picked up so far.
Single member ward were preferable, did you?
Sorry, I have got that one. Single member wards are preferable and as an initial starting point, but we're not, as Councillor Davis said, we're not entirely against them if it makes practical sense.
Thank you, John. Councillor Brown, did you want to come back?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think it would be useful to say with regard to the bilingual point that it would be useful in terms of localism that members could consult with their community and or town councils to get feedback on their views.
Yeah, thank you. Right, is there any other comment to make? Any perception to be voiced? Okay, then we'll just get back to the agenda. The date of the next meeting is the issue, and that was the 7th of April, was it?
7th of April, yeah.
Going from memory, 7th of April. So thank you for your attendance.
So can we talk about forward work programme at all? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Couple of points on there. I'd like to look at the constitution, a bit of the constitution that deals with members' questions to Cabinet during full council meetings, because there are some difficulties there. If I can, it basically says that the questions should not relate to matters of fact. Now, that doesn't really make sense to me, because it also says questions should not contain an expression of opinion. Now, if you take out fact and you take out opinion, I'm not entirely sure what you've got left. So I think it's worth clarifying that section of the Constitution. Yeah. So if we could have a look at that. Yeah. I've also had a request from Councillor Wright that we look at consultancy within the council. I'm not sure if we're the right committee for that, though, whether that's more governance audit or probably performance and overview to look at the costs of consultants and the way consultants are used and identified and so on. But it's something that I think is giving a degree of anxiety when we're facing very extreme financial difficulties. That it's one area that we need to be sure that we are on top of. That's not prejudging what I come up with, but it's worth looking at.
Okay, so we'll add certainly one of those issues, the Constitution one, and we'll take guidance as to which scrutiny committee should be doing the consultancy one.
Yeah, the consultancy one wouldn't be for democratic services, it would be a scrutiny issue, but we'll have a look at seeing where we can get that fed in. Members' questions, yeah, no problem. I'll have a chat with James about how we can get that on there. At council last week, there was the request for this committee to look at the consultation process. I'd already been asked by the cabinet member to put on a members' seminar on what the Let's Talk Monmouthshire platform, and I think we'd be a bit preemptive to have a committee meeting on that before we have that members seminar, so I'm working with comms to try and get that done. If it makes sense, we might delay the April meeting until after that seminar so we can put everything together as one.
Okay, thank you, John. I've just noticed that Councillor Neil wanted to come back.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's just on the issue that Councillor Strong raised. Thank you, Councillor Strong, the suggestion on looking at the cost of consultancy. I'm happy to take that away and move that into the forward plan for performance and overview. It's more complicated than sometimes it appears to be, or there's certainly more layers to it than it may appear to be, because sometimes agency employees can be categorized in the form of consultants, but they perform a really important role in different ways in many cases. And there is the issue of, is it more cost effective to employ a person for a short contractual period rather than an ongoing employee basis? And so it is an important one for us to look at. Sometimes people react to the word consultant in kind of negative terms in the public sector, but I think it's a good suggestion. I've certainly actually had some prior discussion about that with some Democratic Service support. So I'll take that one away. If you're happy I do that, then we'll get it onto the forward plan.
Thank you, Councillor Neil. Very helpful. And we've had some more hands go up since then. Councillor Davis.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to expand on Councillor Strong's remarks, and I think it's very timely of this committee to review the Constitution at our next meeting ahead of our AGM, of course, in May. I mean, members may recall that James Williams did give a presentation to this committee not long ago with some suggested changes to the Constitution. I made some quite substantive, quite detailed comments and observations on that model Constitution, highlighting, amongst other comments, some legacy references to the Welsh Language Act, which of course should read as the Welsh language measure in this post-devolution age. I also highlighted the apparent discrepancy in the Constitution in terms of how a cabinet member may be removed from office vis-a-vis how the leader or a committee member may be removed from office. There were some inconsistencies in terms of the language with regards to those provisions, and I did ask the monitoring officer to reflect on that feedback and those very detailed markups that I shared. I haven't seen, and I'm happy to be stood corrected, I haven't seen any follow-up to that exercise. So perhaps we might instruct James to provide an update on where he's got to in advancing some of the existing feedback that this committee has provided on the Constitution, in addition to some worthwhile ideas or recommendations that we may have anew at that April meeting, as suggested by Councillor Strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Davis. Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you. I think if we're looking again at the Constitution, I'd be interested in looking at the Constitution with regard to the use of council buildings where the council owns the freehold. Currently, on the planning protocol, basically, when the council makes an application, then it has to go to planning committee. So I would like to see changes so that where the council owns the freehold of a building, that also has to go to planning committee and also has to go to licensing committee. This is just to ensure that buildings are used in accordance with the with regard to what the council would like to see the buildings used for.
Yeah, I'll check with the monitoring officer as to where it was. I know following the last Democratic Services Committee meeting, he was then taking those points back to the political group leaders, and I've not heard any update on that either. So it may be that because he brought it to this committee, but all members need to be aware of it, that a members' seminar would be the best approach to update all members on the next process, but I need to check with James. But Councillor Brown, I don't think that was a point you raised at the last Democratic Services meeting when we discussed the Constitution. So if there's anything additional, I'd send that through to James directly now for him to obviously review that as part of the rest of the process before it gets to council for approval. And then we've got to open up going back through it all again.
Just coming back to the point that was made previously, if that's okay, Chair, in relation to a member's seminar about consultations. I mean, there are documents, for example, that suggest how best practice in relation to consultations, and how you should allow at least a 6-week period, and how basically people should be consulted consulted upon basically before the proposals are actually formed, you know, so that they are, you know, fully taken into account in terms of decision making. And that although a members' seminar might assist with training, it doesn't make any recommendations with regard to how consultations are supposed to be run. And that's my concern about it not coming to the committee as well. And, you know, maybe we should send some recommendations to the Boundary Commission as well, you know, because on the last consultation before, they sent the details to the community councillors and the community councils, but they didn't send any information to county councils on the last consultation with regard to the Senedd. So I think it's you know, perhaps they could do with going on the seminar as well, you know, when in terms of asking us. It's also asking people at times when it's difficult for them to respond over school holidays and half terms and things like that. So I personally think a seminar will be useful, but I don't think that takes away the chance of this committee making specific recommendations to Cabinet on how consultation should be run.
I don't think that was the suggestion. Sorry, Councillor Brown. I think it was more that we have a members' seminar on the platforms and the methodology of how the council conducts its consultations at the minute, so that if when the committee considers it, it's got a more informed base to have a debate on it, rather than asking more questions at this stage without an understanding perhaps the Let's Talk platform and how our consultations are run. So it wasn't a suggestion for consultations to come off the agenda at all, just to have the seminar before we debate it, so we have a better evidence base, as we've suggested today, to have that debate as a committee.
Okay, so that we can make recommendations to Cabinet, yeah. Okay, thank you.
That's right, good, right. And lastly, Councillor Davis.
Just a final recommendation, Chairman, for our future work programme. It might be helpful for this committee, John, to receive a paper from you on the Welsh Government's new Innovating Democracy Advisory Group, and particularly how we as a Democratic Services Committee can interface and support the work of that new advisory body, and to understand how Welsh Government intends for that forum to engage and to consult with local authority stakeholders, in particular in the context of improving the democratic experience and deepening voter participation. I mean, it strikes me as being a timely conversation. We might have some fruitful observations, reflections that we may wish to share as an authority, given our own record of being a bit of a trailblazing authority with regards to innovating in the delivery of our public services. There might be some nice synergies and some nice opportunities there for this authority. So might you consider perhaps bringing a paper, not necessarily to the April meeting, but certainly to a future meeting, given that we've had a relatively light workload of late as a committee. It'd be good to have visibility of our future work programme, a bit of beef to get our teeth into as a committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Davis. And I think that's... Did you want to come back there, John?
I'll follow up after the meeting, if that's okay, Councillor Davis. I'm not quite sure of the body you referenced there, but happy to bring a paper forward on what we're doing and how we go about stuff. But if we can link it back to something, if you can share the information after the meeting, then I'll definitely look at doing that.
Right, thank you, John, and thank you, members. Just a reminder that the next meeting scheduled for the 7th of April, was it, may be postponed in light of the seminar. So we just bear in mind that we'll expect or we'll receive some communication from John if the date needs to be changed. So can I thank everybody for your attendance this afternoon, and if you're driving home, safe journey home. If you're at home already, enjoy the next cup of tea or coffee. Diolch yn fawr. Pnawn da.
O'i le, da.